Shalom Aleichem, Nisambula Banaka, Noai Modi. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Fijian Japa. And today I'll be reading about the annual review of political science and the popular topic nowadays, the political theory of populism, from Columbia University, New York. The keywords is audience, direct representation, fascism, majority principle, populist democracy, representative democracy. And then the abstract. Populism is a name of global phenomenon which definitional precautions is proverbial. It resists generalizations, makes scholars of politics comparativist by necessity. As language and content are imbued with the political culture of society in which it arises, a rich body of socio-historical analysis allows to situate populism within the global phenomenon called democracy, and its ideological core is nourished by the two main entities. The nation and the people have fleshed out popular sovereignty in the age of democratization. Populism consists in transmutation of democratic principles of majority of the people in a way that is meant to celebrate one subset of the people as opposed to another for a leader embodying it and audience legitimizing it. This may make populism collide with constitutional democracy, even if man tenors and embedded in the democratic universe of meaning and language. In this article, I'll illustrate the context-based character of populism and how its cycle appearances reflects forms of representative government. I review the main contemporary interpretations of concept and argue that some basic agreement now exists in populism rhetorical character and a strategy for achieving power in democratic societies. Finally, I sketch the main characteristics of populism and power, explain how it tends to transform the fundamentals of democracy, people in the majority, elections, and representations. So let's commence with the introduction. The topic of populism has become increasingly visible and important in contemporary political experience. Although political theory finds it difficult to grapple with populism as it's not new, it emerged along the process of democratization in the 19th century, and since then the characters and forms have mirrored the modes of democracy it challenged. What is novel today is the intensity and simultaneity of the manifestation in almost all countries ruled by constitutional democracy. From Caracas to Budapest to Washington to Rome, any understanding of politics needs to take into account the phenomenon that recently was studied as a subspecies of fascism and relegated to the margins of the West, essentially Latin America, a novel interception among scholars and citizens. Indeed, whereas until the end of the 20th century, interest in populism was strongest among those who saw the problem. In the new century, scholars and citizens have started receiving it only a symptom of decline of representative institutions, but also the opportunity of rejuvenating democracy. However, the term populism is still employed and polemically much more than analytically, often to brand and stigmatize political movements and leaders. Was the mark of their set intention of claiming the liberal democratic model as the only platform democracy can take. Warning particularly over the referendum on Brexit, politicians and media experts have listed as populist or opposition movements from xenophobic nationalist critics to neoliberal policies. As populist, it applies to those who do not themselves criticize rulers, regardless of principles underlying the critique. The side of this polemical approach that makes politics consist of both the governability of populism from the result of making the latter the name of all movements of opposition, and democratic policies essentially the issue of institutional management. Populism is an ambiguous term that escapes sharp and contested definitions because it's not an ideology. Political regime cannot be attributed to a specific programmatic content, but rather a form of collective action aiming to take power. Yet although populism is a way of doing politics which can take various forms depending on the periods and places, it cannot be compatible with the non-democratic forms of politics because it possesses attempt to build collective subject through consent and questions social order. Name populism strives to appeal to many people, feel the concerns described by established elite groups. Yet while populist interpretation of these people stresses inclusion of the ordinary many, this inclusion occurs through a parallel process of exclusion. The political establishment of the externality against populism people's positions itself, where populism cannot exist. Hence, regardless of the ideological connotation appeal to people may take right or left, argue that populism is structurally marked by radical, particularly an interpretation of people in the majority. This implies that the populist movement comes to power, can be disagreeing impact, institutions, rule and law, and division of powers that comprise constitutional democracy. In effect, it can stretch constitutional democracy towards an extreme borders and open the door to authoritarian solutions and even dictatorship. The paradox that should this regime take place, populism should be unseated. Populism's destiny is tied to democracy and never again taking place in its performance. And some scholars have employed the metaphor of parasite and explain a peculiar relation to democracy. Whatever the analogy of those deeply contextual manifestation impacts depends on political, social, and religious culture of the country. Populism is more an historical contingent, phenomenon, and movement of contestation. It pertains to the transformations of modern democracy. The reference point of the theoretical approach. Therefore, although we simply do not have anything like a theory of populism, political theorists can pivot on its endogenous link with democracy, while normative foundations procedures are very familiar to us. Populism is not a regime of its own, and style and tenor a derivative of democracy, type of democracy such as grounded in the representation of constitution. They use elections along with occasion derived from popular vote, such as a referendum and plebiscite, which is a political arena is made of issue-based associations and partisan affiliations, not solely individual and actors in elections. Populism emerges of the domain of opinion, questions all of those features of democracy. More specifically, it exploits the perception of the parliamentary and party politics fails to provide adequate representation for some key portions of population. It questions electoral mandate representation because of a gap it creates between people with the principle of legitimacy, people with the actual social reality, and thus between the electors and the elected. Populism must fill that gap to make it measure political justice and legitimacy, but it claims that any strategy to secure some power of the nation against internal and internal enemies, such as powerful youth establishment, legal capitalism, immigration, or Islamic fundamentalism. The dominant factors in today's successful populist rhetoric. The problem is that populism is people does not represent itself. Populists do call for historic self-governance. Populism's adverse identity to claim the representative leader as who mobilizes the Media to convince the audience to embody the people many forms of this content against traditional parties, spineless mainstream. Lukau has argued that a populist regime take the name of the leader without undermining the reader, but neither claiming to embody it. Populism cannot achieve power and means very much movement of contestation against trend in society which betrays some basic democratic principles and equality in particular. Yet populism is more than rhetorical style and political protest. Therefore, political theory of populism has yet to focus on populism into power and where populism interprets uses and changes representing democracy and main target in contemporary experience. The analysis of populism and power leads to conclude that although the internal transformation of representative democracy, populism can disfigure it by making the principle of democratic legitimacy. The people are the majority in the position of power of the people, are strongly embodied and mobilizing in certain parts, minority of political opposition. Populism is power and extreme militarization. In the first section below, I illustrate the context-based character of populism and show how in its cyclical appearances, both forms of representative government. In the second section, I review the main contemporary interpretations, argue that some basic agreements now exist in populism and rhetorical character, strategy for achieving power in democratic societies. Based on his rich body of scholarship in the last section, I sketch the main characteristics of populism and power, explain the intents to transform the fundamentals of democracy, people majority elections and representations. This is the novelty of the contemporary populism, which promotes a direct relation between the leader and the people, relies on the superlative authority on the audience, shadows intermediary actors such as parties and accredited media, as well as institutional rules, bureaucracy, and monitoring agencies. As Roswell terminology, populism takes advantage of mechanisms and negative politics. Counter democracy, the constitutional democracy guarantees. Populist democracy challenges party democracy. It succeeds to stabilize itself by using excess means democracy offers. It fosters permanent mobilization of people opinion in support of leading government. If possible, rewrites the constitution and rights populism seeks to occupy the space of constituent power. Okay, there's a few pages here, so it's going to go for ages. Context and comparisons. Populism is the name of global phenomenon, which definitional precariousness is proverbial and resists generalizations and makes scholars of politics comparativist by necessity. This language and content are imbued in political culture of the society, which it arises in some countries as the populace representatives takes on religious trains, while in others may be secular and nationalist ones in the language of republican patriotism. While in others, the indigeneity, nativism, and myth of first occupants. In some countries, it stresses the center-periphery cleavage, while in others, in city countryside one. In the past, some populist experiences have rooted in collectivist agrarian traditions, attempted to resist modernization, westernization, and all industrialism. Others embodied a self-made man, ideal of popular culture, and valued small-scale entrepreneurship, and still others who claim state intervention and government modernization to protect and succor the well-being of the middle class. The variety of paths represent populism extraordinary in the way in the right and Latin America is necessary but in Europe and the United States. So that holds true in Northern and Western Europe, but does not apply in the eastern or southern areas of the whole continent. What Berlin wrote of Romanticism can be said of populism. When anyone embarks on generalization of the phenomenon, even of an anarchist one, Somebody will always be found that we produce convincing evidence that should suffice to the guard as against Horace Differentoria. Yet the importance of populism does not depend on its ability to be rendered in a clear and distinct idea, a movement that escapes generalizations and yet is tangible and capable of transforming the lives of thoughts and people, and started embracing it as scholars in 1967. Comments of London School of Economics showed that pioneering interdisciplinary analyzing of global populism. Populism is a component of political world we live in and signals a transformation of democratic political system. Perhaps we cannot say populism what Berlin said, accompanying romanticism was gigantic radical transformation after when nothing was the same, yet we see populism as part of gigantic global phenomenon called democracy and its ideological core, nourished by two main entities, ethnos and demos, the nation and people. And the first, the popular sovereignty in the age of democratization beginning in the 18th century. What populism does to a democratic society, and traces it leaves is likely to change both the style and content of public disclosure, even though they're not the same rolling over than have the change in the constitution. The transformative potential of the horizon, which will suggest we situate a political theory of populism. Since populism cannot be rendered as a precise concept, scholars are rightly skeptical that it might be treated as a distinct phenomenon that is ideological creation. The subject is well posed. However, the simple fact the term is currently used of such persistence in everyday politics and academic publications justifies a critical and scholarly attention. Studying populism demands they will be attentive to the context which is being locked up in it. In the early stages of the study of populism, scholars identify direction against the process of modernization and pre-democratic and post-colonial societies and difficult transformation of representative government in democratic societies. The term populism emerged in the second half of the 19th century, first in Russia and then in the United States in the People's Party, describing respectively the intellectual vision and ethical political movement and idealized an American society of community villages and individual producers against industrialization and corporate capitalism. In Russia, the first populist voice was that of intellectuals who imagined an ideal community of uncontaminated peasants. While in the United States, it was a voice of the very citizens who contested the ruling elites of the name of the Constitution. The later, and thus the first instance of populism, is a political movement. The process itself is a representative of people in the party system and government. Yet in the United States, of populism does not bring about regime changes, but develop among way of political democratization, to speak the language of the inclusion of the last strata of the population, time when politics was elected obligatory. In democratizing context, populism can be a strategy for rebalancing the distribution of political power, more established emerging social groups. Important historical cases of populist regimes emerged in Latin American countries. Here, populism was capable of becoming a ruling power after World War II and met with mixed feelings depending on whether it was battling the beginning of its rise in the apex of opposition or party movement against the existing government, the government itself. And then as a regime and its consolidation, a regime facing a cessation of power. As in Russia, the United States, and Latin America, populism emerged as age of socio-economic modernization, but like fascism in Europe's Catholic countries, led the way to modernity by using state power to protect popular and middle classes, thwarting political dissent, taming liberal ideology, and meanwhile implementing moral policies, protecting traditional ethical values. In Western Europe, populism made its appearance in the pre-democratic regimes in the early 20th century, along with colonial expansion and militarization of social society. World War I and growth of ethnic nationalism was a response of economic depression and rival existing ideological divisions in the myth of encompassing nation. In pre-democratic Europe, populism response to the crisis of representative government translated into the formation of fascist regimes. Populism became the name of form of government of the collapse of fascism in Latin America. Since then, as a political form between constitutional government and dictatorship, it displays varying resemblance to opposite political systems such as democracy and fascism. Today, populism grows by both democratizing and fully democratic societies, although it takes us most mature, we can propose constitutional representative democracy is the real target. As a general trend to be drawn to these different contexts, we see that populism challenges representing government from within and eventually moves beyond denunciation and must substantial reshape democracies and new political regime. Unlike fascism, however, populism does not spin free competitive elections and others deny a legitimate role. In fact, they show legitimacy in defining dimension and populist regimes. Break. Interpretations. Contemporary scholarship on populism can be divided into two broad groups. One more was attentive to circumstances social conditions of populism, and one mainly interested in populism itself as a political nature and its characteristics. The former of the main are political history and comparative social studies, the latter political theory and conceptual history. Scholarship that is concerned in conditions of specific developments of populism is skeptical of reliability of theorizing form from empirical cases. For students of populism, as well as students of democracy, social history experience is essential in understanding subtypes of broad category. Yet, with populism, unlike with democracy, it is hard to find agreement on what the broad character contains. Populism is an ambiguous concept that does not correspond to specific political regime. Consequently, the subtypes of populism in historical analysis produces a risk allowing scholars of the context where they study the paradox that each so-called subtype becomes a unique case. The end result, the community populism that is their populism, but historical social analysis gains in depth of study, there is experience and loss in generalization among the criteria for judging these experiences. Theoretical integration of conceptualization analysis is thus necessary. An early attempt to combine conceptual analysis and conceptual generalization is found in taxonomy of variations of types and subtypes, populism in relation to cultural, religious, social, economic, and political conditions. This taxonomy is object of important corpus as represented in the volume by Eniscu and Gilner, as well as essays by Cannabon. A true pioneer in the study of populism, Cannabon's work relies on a broad range of sociological analysis. This is inspired by Gino Germani and Taco de Talla. These two Argentinian scholars, the former in exile from fascist Italy, forerunners in devising the descriptive category of populism, explain how societies that are lost when they are not nation-states. Constructing the people's trust makes populism as functional project. To Cannabon, the relation to political regimes, the content of people, these are the basic references, points to scholars that are interpreting the real conditions and circumstances of populism. Cannabon brings scholars on populism on extremely theoretical normative domain, related to the issue of political legitimacy. The theories of populism we dispose of today fall in two types of directions: achieving a minimalization theory and devising a maximal theory form aimed at sharpening tools of interpretation that enables us to recognize the phenomenon that we see at extraction of some minimal conditions in the various cases of populism for analytical purposes. The latter has more than an analytical function, and in fact the claims on effectuabilities offers citizens template can follow together the collective subject capable of winning over the majority and ruling, particularly in terms of institutional crisis. Decline of judicial parties legitimately this project can play a political role in reshuffling of the existing democratic order. That was 25 minutes. Let's have a quick break. Vaping is good for study. I advise people at uni, people who are studying, to vape helps with study. Hence the reason when you read, it's hard to accumulate the information and retain the information in the cognitive. That's why I like to read a lot and vape a lot. It reduces stress levels, your stresses, and your cognitive, your mindset. It helps you study. A lot of people have different types of oxygen to their study as well. The words of our Postman Joe says, Maimonides, it teaches happy to know your progress. Hence the reason I told myself I didn't know. I only heard about populism from watching the World Bank. Now I know from the research that it's gone back centuries. Topical populism. So teach yourself you don't know your progress. My one knees. Okay, back to reading. A minimalist theory of populism. Within the minimalist theory, we include the all these interpretations of populism that analyze its ideological tropes, its styles of politics in relation to rhetorical apparatus and national culture, the strategies devised by leaders to achieve power. The goal of this endeavor is to avoid normative judgments, pursue an unprejudiced understanding and inclusive as possible all experiences of populism. Model has contributed to most defining the ideological frame of his non-normative minimalism. He claims populism looks like a thin-scented ideology, considers society to ultimately separate into two homogeneous and antagonist groups, which argues that politics should be expression of general for the people. Capable of straightening the left-right divide, movements of populist by reasoning of Manichaean moral appraisal of politics, thanks of which they are reserves, belong to general, the mode of liberal respect, the civil rights, and the rights of minorities of the particular, neither representation the role of the leader, nor the radicalization of majority figures, and the minimalization rendering. However, the ideological contraposition between the honest many and corrupt peers in unique populist rhetoric comes from a republican tradition that dates back to ancient Rome, whose polity was structure based on dualism between the people and the elite, and on popular mistrust of the elite. Furthermore, for the different intensities, dualism of we good, they had the murder forms of all partisan aggregation. Clearly, certain popular style can be detected in almost all parties, particularly when they radicalize claims in the elections. Stressing the political style makes us capable of crossing a variety of political and cultural contexts, but we may miss that as peculiar to populism versus democracy. Dialogical and stylistic approaches are not attentive enough to the institutional and procedural aspects that qualify democracy when populism emerges and operates. These approaches diagnose the emergence of polarization between many of the few to now explain that makes populism anti-establishment position different from what we can find in Republican paradigm, traditional oppositional politics, and democratic partisanship. This is what a third trajectory internal to descriptive approach is able to do when it reads populism primarily as a strategic movement that highlights the party structure, the manipulation, institutions, and procedures, the role of the leader, all in achieving ruling power by conquering the consent of majority. According to Whalen, populism is best defined as a political strategy through which a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, institutionalized support from large numbers of most unorganized followers. Despite its grassroots discourse, populism boils down on the manipulation of masses by the elites. However, although tutors blow against corruption as a single majority, it may predictably end up in accelerating rather than curing corruption. Because it's once in power, the populist regime needs to distribute favors, use state resources to protect its coalition majority over time. Populism is a powerful form of elective democracy, a gigantic machinery of nepotistic favors, which is orchestrating propaganda that imputes the ability to delivering the promises to a powerful international and domestic conspiracy. The strategic approach is persuasive and capacious, but it does not link populism directly to transformation and democracy. It judges the strategy's success by the outcome of its producers, then not based on normative criteria and the relative impact on democratic institutions and procedures. Moreover, since electoral associates is part and parcel of democracy, all parties aspire to majority, large and long-lasting, it's still unclear what makes populism so different or more risky to representing democracy. Probably not long. I'll just probably read one more segment. Two more segments. Okay, a minimalist theory of populism. How much time is that? 32 minutes? Within the minimalist theory, we include all these interpretations of populism analyze ideological tropes, their styles of politics in relation to rhetorical apparatus and national culture, and strategies devised by leaders to achieve power. The goal of this endeavor is to avoid normative judgments, pursue an unprejudiced understanding to be inclusive of possible experiences, and populism is considered the most defining the logical frame. It's non-normative minimalism. He thinks populism looks like a thin-skinned ideology that considers society to also be scarce, separated into two homogeneous and into agnostic groups, which argues that politics should be expression of general or people. Capable of shading the left-right divide, movements of populist reasons in the American moral plays the politics thanks to which they elaborate ratios to general to make liberal aspects for general civil rights, the rights of minorities in particular. Another presentation of the role of leaders and liberalization of majority figures and the minimalist rendering of the ideological contraposition between the honest, many, corrupt as a unique populist rhetoric comes from public tradition that dates back to ancient Rome, whose polity was structured based on dualism between the people and the elite, and on popular stress on the elite. Furthermore, although of different intensities, the dualism of was good was the mode of all forms and partisan aggregation. Clearly, a certain populist style can be detected in almost all parties, particularly when they radicalize their claims in the elections. Stressing the political style makes it capable of crossing a variety of political and cultural contexts, but we missed that it's peculiar to populism versus democracy. The ideological stylistic approaches are not attentive enough to institutionalize procedural aspects that qualify democracy within populism measures and operates. These approaches diagnose the emergence popularization between many of the